these institutions that are inherited by the government, which comes soon after the popular uprising, tend to be weak and corrupt, because those are in large measure defining characteristic, hallmarks of the authoritarian regimes. Now, the length and nature of the authoritarianism actually tells us what would be the shape of this institution. When these are longer authoritarian period, they tend to be weaker and more fragile, and more corrupt in both financial sense as well as the political sense. So maintaining status quo within these institutions becomes challenged, because already these are weak, they're corrupt. And if you want to maintain the status quo, which is basically an extension of the authoritarian regime, you don't want to do that. But at the same time, this is what you have inherited. Two institutions have emerged as critical element in this immediate aftermath. One is judiciary, another is military or security apparatuses. They have become very, very critical in many, many places where the democratic transition phase efforts have been made. In Egypt, for example, clash between the Morsi government and the judiciary became a key issue after Muslim Brotherhood was elected. Concurrently, the military had decided to restore the previous order, and thus a coup re-established the military regime, from which the entire Egyptian popular uprising was intended to do. In Sudan, for example, military, although initially appeared very neutral, occasionally supportive, have played very key role. The collapse of the civilian-military partnership, which was developed after the uprising, has collapsed because the military, although it appeared neutral initially, didn't want to cede its power. They want to keep it. And plunged the whole country in Sudan into a civil war, and followed by a coup. Now, in Tunisia, the military has remained on the sideline, except on security issues, and protected its corporate interest, which impeded democratic transition, although didn't derail it altogether. Later we saw some backsliding, but immediately aftermath we didn't in a shorter period. In Sri Lanka, on the other hand, military remained aloof to the changes. The other point that I mentioned is historical grievances. As you can understand, the long period of authoritarian regime actually perpetrate injustices, human rights violation, and in many instances, that is, the autocratic regime is engaged with large-scale human rights violation. In some cases, they are nothing short of crimes against humanity. As we all know, in case of Bangladesh, the crimes against humanity has been perpetrated. Now, so where there are ethnic differences in Middle East or elsewhere, including Sri Lanka, what we have seen that ethnic or religious group or region became more targeted during the authoritarian regime. There's one dimension to it, but large-scale human rights violation is already there. So, post-uprising, the transition government, and in post-conflict situation as well, we have seen the effort of truth and reconciliation process. Now, either truth and reconciliation processes have been established, or in some cases they have made legal reforms so that they can address the situation. What happened is this, that if we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission globally, what we gather is this, that the result is at best mixed. In case of South Africa, we have seen it succeeded to a great extent. In case of El Salvador, it didn't. And El Salvador is not an exception. There are others. The lesson is this Truth and Reconciliation Commission or efforts, processes cannot be an exoneration of those who have committed heinous crimes, crimes against humanity. That needs to be ensured that they're brought to book. The next one that I mentioned is inclusive participation. And inclusive participation is a serious challenge in the democratic transition. Why? There's no disagreement. The diverse groups should be participated, people's all voices should be incorporated. But the thorny question is, how do you engage those who have been part of the previous regime, especially those who have undermined democracy, systematically perpetrated violence, adopted ideology of authoritarianism, or systematically vitiated the process which contributed to the survival of the regime. This is, to describe it, this process, this challenge as thorny issue is just an understatement. On the one hand, you are required to become inclusive, but on the other hand, how do you make sure that those who have undermined the process, created the situation, where do you place them? This is a problem that has not been dealt uniformly. There is no one-size-fits-all kind of situation. But nevertheless, this is a question that has come up again and again. Those countries which have tried to make two things parallel. One is the reconciliation, another is the trial of those who have contributed to this enormous human rights violation incidents. Last challenge is autocratic nostalgia. What we have seen as the democratization process, especially those which has experienced violence, usually this follows with disorder and instability. When there are violent episodes or large-scale violence associated with the popular uprising. So what happened is, subsequently, you'd see some disorder, law and order, economic crisis. Some citizens tend to long for the stability that they have seen. Because in many instances, and if you allow me, I can say in most instances, authoritarian regime provides a quote-unquote stability because it suppresses any kind of discontent. Brutally, dissent is completely pushed on the margin, sometimes underground. So you see a stability. And that is what becomes a point post-transition. Because some people think that, look, here is the disorder. Wasn't I better before? This is what I call the autocratic nostalgia. In recent years, we have seen this phenomena in some of the Middle East and North Africa region. Tunisia is a case in point that I mentioned. And this is a result of two-pronged thing. Number one is the campaign of misinformation and disinformation vis-a-vis the current government. And this is, all this, what I'm saying, is largely drawn on the experience of other countries. I haven't talked about Bangladesh yet. Because the supporter of the deposed regime engage in deliberate effort to resist democratic reform and undermine any kind of consolidation of democracy. So it is them who contributes to this disinformation unless the government succeeds in countering those with fact and provide some semblance of stability or law and order. It becomes a very serious challenge. Now, these are the lessons that we can draw as I say, 60% of them not succeeding, 40% or so succeeding. So where these things have been addressed properly, then it is largely we have seen the transition into democracy. Where some or many of these couldn't be addressed properly, that has resulted in a reversal. Success has been just reversed into Egypt is a case in point, into military regime or something of that kind, or they plunged into a very chaotic situation, civil war. Iraq is a case in point. But where these are maintained, even before 2000, in large measure, there will be sporadic incident. There has been. Sri Lanka is a case in point. Or even previously, if you look at the transition in whole Eastern Europe scenario, they succeeded to a great extent because this was somehow could be addressed. Now, how do we address this in the context of Bangladesh? What do we learn from these things? As I said, we are in a transition phase from autocracy to democracy. Now, when we talk about challenges in any context, we tend to describe that the challenge is for the government. In a normal situation, it's fine. In a democratic situation, however weak, fragile democracy it is, we usually talk about challenges to the government, how government is going to do it, whether government would succeed or not. But it is my argument, what I'm going to insist, these challenges that Bangladesh is facing currently, 4 of them, or what are the challenges, not only now, going forward, 4 I'm going to highlight. There are challenges for the government, of course. I mean, day-to-day governance issues there, isn't it? Police has to be on the street, shops has to be open, and so on and so forth. But those are the governance, immediate governance issues. But what I would urge, and what I would insist, that when a country is undergoing a democratic transition, as we are, the challenges to the process should not be viewed as a challenge of the government alone. Rather, where we are standing today in 2025, when we are amid the transition process, I think these 4 challenges are to the political class of this country. You can say, okay, even if you don't want to say political class, we can say political forces, irrespective of their political parties. I think, drawing on these, the first thing, I would say transition to a democratic system requires a peaceful and orderly election. Countries which have succeeded in transitioning to democracy in varying degrees have been successful in organizing peaceful elections. Now, the experience of transition in Eastern Europe in 1990, the Philippines in the 1980s, Sri Lanka after 2022, all bear this out. On the contrary, the entire Middle East and North Africa, they didn't. And we have seen what happened there. Tunisia succeeded to a great extent. That's why we have seen some progress in Tunisia. The rest of the countries didn't do as good. Now the point is, while the responsibility of the transitional government to organize the election, the stake is far greater for the political parties who would see the election, who would see the transition to ensure that an election is not only a matter of who would get to the power. The election is the first step in making sure that they are closing the chapter on authoritarian past. That's why it requires openness, it requires ability to compromise, make concession while this election is organized. Drawing on other experiences we have seen where they have succeeded in doing it, because it is not who is going to power in the next election. Timing of the election is not inconsequential. I'm not suggesting that one. But 2 points are important. The first thing is to ensure that whether it would be orderly and peaceful. Second, whether the political parties can agree to a modus operandi that their behavior won't be impediment to the process, and by default would help justify the previous regime's sham election, because if the process is not agreed upon, the transitional government, in this instance in Bangladesh, the interim government, will have to lead the process. But let me tell you, it alone cannot ensure it. The job of the interim government is to act as a transitional government. They can lead it, but they alone would not be able to close the chapter on the past of having a peaceful, orderly transition unless the political forces come to an agreement in writing or unwritten that what exactly is trying to achieve through the election. There is a distinct difference between a transitional election and election at a regular time. They have to realize it, understand it, appreciate it, participate in it. The second is reforming the state apparatuses and creating a new social contract. Bangladesh's history of 53 years, not only 16, the governance history that you all too familiar with, has clearly made it evident that return to the business as usual is not an option for democratization. If everything had worked, then we wouldn't have been in this situation. We have to realize that. If everything had worked, the institutions had worked, processes worked, system works, we wouldn't have been here. We wouldn't have a 16 years of personal autocracy. We wouldn't have so many people had to die, right? So it is not an option. First, we need to accept that. That's not an option. Status quo or business as usual is not an option by any means. Now, how do you make those changes, that would actually ensure that institutions that are supposed to function better? Will they be perfect? Of course not. But will they be better and would actually enable the transition into democracy? Now, those which has enabled the rise of autocracy in constitution as well as in the laws, in the practices, they have to be revised, amended, rewritten, however you put it. It's not a matter of simply thinking that whether we are going to do it. You have to do it because otherwise you are not going to get there. So, the most important thing is that driven by what is there in the constitution will not be helpful. We shouldn't start what is there. It helps. Say, for example, in case constitution, it helps what is there. But you have to add to that what the lessons are of the last 16 years, preferably beyond that. So, how do you make those institutional changes? First, it cannot be the responsibility of the interim government alone. Rather, it is the responsibility of the political parties. Why? Because they are the one who would govern in future or be part of the government, political landscape. So it is incumbent on them. They have to realize that they are doing it for themselves. Not because interim government wants it, not because only a popular uprising. It is because doing it for themselves. That is the one. But is it only between the political parties? No. It is a contract between the citizens and the political parties as to what are they offering at this point. They have to be very transparent. For their own sake, and it's not simply a rhetoric issue. And how do you reach there? All political parties are different. That's why they're political parties, that's why they're different. We're not in a one-party state. We cannot bring everyone and say, okay, you have to agree to this and then become one party. That's not what we fought for. So the key is making compromises where needed without giving up the basic fundamental principles or the ideology they ascribe to. That requires a change in the political culture. Zero-sum game is not going to help us. Neither in the election that is going to take place at some point or other sooner. The third challenge is the trials of the autocrats, especially those who were in the command responsibility. For the past 16 years, the government was based largely on force. Hence, we have seen the violation of human rights rampantly. We have seen instances of crimes against humanity, but those who perpetrated it, particularly those who were in command responsibility, because if they enjoy the impunity, it is basically antithetical to the process that you are trying to close the chapter of the past. You have to move beyond. And that can only be done through due process and ensuring that justice is served. And that has to be the trials. A transparent process that would enable to convince everybody in the sense that the justice has been delivered. The fourth point is our transition depends on another thing. The world is changing as we speak. The world changes every day, any day. But the dramatic shifts that are taking place is going to have an impact on how we transition. Particularly, the reason is our neighbor. The India's interest that was served, which now is in jeopardy, creates an uneasy relationship with Bangladesh, whereas the Indian government is still failing to acknowledge the seismic shift that has taken place in this country. Going forward, it is the political parties, they have to formulate their own policies vis-à-vis the global politics as well as regional one, particularly India. It is necessary for the political parties to speak very clearly as to how they would deal with these changing circumstances. Interim government is here for a shorter period. They are doing it as they see it fit. In some cases, they are being criticized. In some cases, they are being applauded. But the point is how, in a long-term political situation, this should be addressed. This is a challenge. Is it a challenge for the interim government? Yes, it is a challenge because they are maintaining the government. But it is a challenge for the political parties. These are the issues that is going to have immense impact on these four that I have talked about. Having an orderly transition of power, that reforming the institution and having a social contract with the citizen, trial of those who were in command responsibilities as well as perpetrators, and finally coming up with a better and comprehensive foreign policy or international relations, however you put it. These are the challenges that I see in transitioning. All of them, in some way, in variation, will have an impact whether Bangladesh would succeed in transitioning. We can be part of 40%, we can be part of 60%. That is a choice, and that is a choice ours to make. Thank you.